This is one of those video games that I have a long history with. It was probably one of the very last Atari 2600 games I got new back in the day, so needless to say, it's a pretty nostalgic game for me, but it's one that I never really hear anybody else talking about. I actually mentioned that in my Atari 2600 Hidden Gems video. Not sure it's actually a hidden gem, but to me it is. And this time around, I'm just here to do something about people not talking about Stargate. Stargate is the sequel to Defender, released in arcades a year after its predecessor. Williams kept with what worked in Defender and added to it with Stargate. More enemies, more challenge, and of course the titular Stargate, a portal which will teleport you right to where the danger is. If you're not familiar with the gameplay of Defender, or this game for that matter, an alien craft called landers descend from the sky and attempt to abduct the humanoids that are on the ground below. Your job is to protect them and clear the waves of invaders. Of course, there's more enemies than just the landers, and they all have a different target in mind, and that target is you. When a lander successfully abducts a humanoid, it gets turned into a mutant, and that joins the assault on your craft. Thankfully, your ship is not a sitting duck. It can maneuver with ease, has a big cannon on the front that's your main attack. Then it also has a limited number of screen-clearing smart bombs as well. You also have the ability to cloak briefly and do short hyperspace jumps as well. On this Atari 2600 version, those last three abilities are all accessed by the second player controller, which, if you ask me, is not very convenient when you're trying to avoid the flying saucers and whatnot that could be potentially crashing into you. So I personally almost never use them. One thing that I think's of note is that unlike Missile Command, another classic game where you have to defend people below from attacks, this game doesn't end if all the humanoids are gone. This game keeps going until you defeat 100 waves of enemies or you run out of lives, making the game more about getting a high score rather than saving all the humanoids. If you wanted to, you could go and shoot them all down yourself and then focus on the aliens. And if that's the case, you're a monster. As I mentioned before, the biggest difference between Stargate and Defender is the addition of the Stargate itself, a teleport device which will send you to the nearest humanoid in distress. It might sound like it makes things a little easier, but with all the other aliens on your tail, it's only a small advantage. Comparing this game to Defender on Atari 2600, this is a much better looking game with much smoother scrolling, which is not very surprising being it's such a later release. Defender released a year after the arcade on the 2600, and this released a whole 6 years after its arcade counterpart. A whole 10 years into the life of the Atari 2600, as a matter of fact. Both games do use a bit of a sprite flicker when you're firing to make up for some of the technical shortcomings. Both games also move noticeably slower compared to the arcade counterparts, making for a slightly easier experience, but there's still a decent amount of challenge. The presentation as a whole is a huge improvement over the 2600 version of Defender, but that's a little surprise. A few of the sound effects aren't too far off from the original 2600 Defender, which is also not a surprise as the 2600 was never known for its sound. The original Atari 2600 version of Defender was not a bad game, but to me, it just doesn't seem like the same game as the arcade game or other ports. It's nowhere as far off or as bad as the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man, but still a little bit different. It's not a bad game, but some may find it underwhelming. For those, I think they would get much more enjoyment out of Stargate. I was one who actually played Stargate on the 2600 before playing the 2600 version of Defender, so that's speaking from experience. I'm sure this does not surprise you one bit, but this game definitely gets a recommendation from me. If you're a fan of Defender or horizontal shooters in general on the 2600, this is a game you will want to pick up, and picking it up, not too difficult. It'll set you back $10 for a loose cart of Stargate on the 2600. It might be a little bit more if you get the Red Label Defender 2, and I know I forgot to mention that Defender 2 is the same game, just with a different title. For some reason, I can only assume it's legal or copyright reasons. The name of the game changed at some point, I'm assuming around 88 or 89. Judging by the dates of the NES/Famicom versions. Famicom version got the name Stargate, and the NES version got the name Defender 2. Just a little something I find interesting, and Are you a fan of horizontal shooters? Let me ask you, what's your favorite? Or do you prefer something classic like Defender or Stargate, or do you prefer something a little more refined, say like Gradius, or even something a little more modern like Einhander? Love to hear what you think. Leave a comment down below. Hope you've enjoyed this review. If you did, give me a thumbs up. If you want to see more, click that subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care.